All right, welcome once again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from around the world. I request if you could please put yourselves on mute as you join. My name is Alexandra Towns. I'm the Research Translation Strategy Lead for Laser Pulse, and I have the pleasure this morning of speaking to all of you about embedded research translation. As you start to join, I welcome everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat. We've planned a really engaging session for the next 55 minutes, and the more we're able to create that community earlier on, I think the more we can all get out of the session. Next slide, please. So today we will be presenting on Laser Pulse's embedded research translation model, an innovative approach for collaborative research impact. And I have the pleasure of co-presenting. And if I could request that all the co-presenters please have your videos up so you can wave when I introduce yourselves. I will be presenting alongside Dr. Laura Rittering, Research Translation Advisor for Laser Pulse, Dr. Priyanka Brunesi, Research Scientist at Purdue University and Laser Pulse, Juan Posado Borblano, Project Manager of the Laser Pulse Project Support to Traditional Cultural Practices in Northern Iraq, and Dr. Yuan Yi, Academic Director of Laser Pulse and Professor at Purdue University. I encourage you all to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. As I mentioned, we designed this to be a really interactive and engaging session, and we will be having several Menti exercises that we invite you all to participate in. We encourage questions, +1, thumbs up, etc. in the chat. At this time, I will pass the presentation over to Yuan Yi to introduce the Laser Pulse program. Over to you, Yuan.
Thank you, Alex. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So I just want to give a little background about Laser Pulse. Laser Pulse is a collaborative agreement with Purdue University with about $70 million ceiling as part of the Higher Education Solution Network 2.0. In addition to Purdue, we have other consortium partners, including Catholic Relief Services, Indiana University, Macquarie University, and University of Notre Dame. Now, the scope of Laser Pulse is really broad. We actually work in all USAID sectors with all USAID partner countries. So our main theory of change, as listed here, is really believe that the closer collaboration between academic researchers, development professionals, and policymakers and donors together we will be able to move the needle in terms of addressing the global challenge. So we have about 6 main components of activities in Laser Pulse, and primarily, we really take a system approach to understand the life cycle of research, and we identify those 6 areas as something that we really need to focus to make a systematic change to maximize the impact of the research product. And this including providing funding, strengthen capacity of all the partners involved in the research, integrated gender consideration in research, and identify a right area for research activity. And of course, the ERT that you will be listening a little bit more about, embedded research translation. And we also want to ensure integrating gender consideration in all our research activity. And because of all this activity, we also develop a network over 2,700 of researcher, practitioner, and policymaker in this network. So today, we're just going to share with you our innovation in embedded research translation. Back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Yuan. This time, Dr. Laura Rittering will present on some findings of a research translation literature review that we carried out in the past few years. Over to you, Laura.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I'd like to begin with the basic question of what is research translation. And I have a Menti that should be pulled up soon. You can see the link in the chat to go there. And I want you to type in that Menti, what does research translation mean to you? What does that phrase mean? And if you could describe it in 5 words. And hopefully as people start answering it, we can begin to see some of the words coming up on the screen. Great, there we go. Thanks for participating. So we see practice, collaboration, impact, findings, practical, use, relevant, end user driven. This is great. Thanks everybody. As you can see, there's a lot of words moving around about what research translation can mean. And at Laser Pulse, we also thought that there was a confusion or just a general lack of clarity on what research translation meant. So I'll give about 30 more seconds to see if anybody else wants to participate in the Mentee. Again, the link is in the chat and you go to that website and you can put in answers for us. So I see a lot about solution, usable, scale up, useful, use, and obviously about practice. So we can go back to the presentation. Thank you very much for that. So as we saw, there's not one name or one process or one specific thing that means research translation. In conventional research approaches, the assumption is that research findings will eventually lead to impact. However, research is sometimes irrelevant, unused, or wasted. Therefore, there's many alternative research approaches. McKibben et al., for example, they identified more than 100 terms that discovered research translation in almost 3,000 articles. Similarly, Tetro et al., they conducted interviews with 33 health research funding agencies in 9 countries and identified 29 terms like research translation. Therefore, the profusion of related terminology and concepts creates a real challenge for researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to improve evidence generation and application to address complex development challenges. So at the most basic level, research translation is implementing evidence in decision-making. Most scholars agree that the aim of research translation is to improve and increase the use of evidence in policy and practice. However, there's scant research to clarify the plurality of approaches implemented to improve and use the uptake of research evidence for global development challenges. Furthermore, this conceptual conclusion and the lack of key principles to apply different research translation approaches can lead to implementation failures. Therefore, based on Laser Pulse's experience and this lit review, we argue that students and faculty can better integrate and connect academic research to support innovation through research translation partnerships. Because it is a beneficial two-way exchange, as academics can ensure their research is rigorous and useful, and practitioners can enhance the research methods to capture evidence and ensure that's applied well. Next slide, please. I have one more Mentee for you. I want to know how often you've engaged in different research translation practices. So Patrick just put the link in the chat again. And so on a sliding scale from I've never used them to I've used them all the time, select how often you've conducted research for application, used research evidence to inform practice or policies, co-produced research at the team with researchers and practitioners, or co-produced research to inform practice or policy making. I'll give about 30 seconds and we'll watch the sliders move as more people respond. Great. So it looks like the most common of our audience then is to use research evidence to inform practice or policies. And the least common is to co-produce research to inform practice or policy making. And there's a wide range of this, to conducting research for application and also co-producing research with researchers. So thank you very much for engaging with me in the Mentee. It's helpful to know where our audience is. Back to the presentation slides, please. So as we saw from that, there's a range of experiences people have in using evidence and co-producing knowledge. So these were our research questions to understand how researchers and practitioners use evidence to inform practice, and second, co-produce knowledge to inform practice. So Laser Pulse undertook this literature review to understand the scope of current research translation practices. You can click next, please. Develop a research translation framework, and to situate the Laser Pulse embedded research translation model within the literature. Next, for this review, we conducted a preliminary scoping review to create a comprehensive list of research translation keywords. And then we selected the five approaches to conduct our review with. We searched for those 5 keywords in the Web of Science portal and identified 125 articles that were relevant to answer our questions. And then we carried out 3 rounds of qualitative analysis on 93 articles to deepen our understanding of research translation. Next slide. We found that our 2 research questions guiding the review were how researchers and practitioners use evidence to inform practice, and how do they co-produce knowledge to inform practice were more interrelated than we expected. We hypothesized that some research translation approaches would be more linear and others would be more iterative. However, we found that research translation is more complex. Each approach defines and uses evidence differently and works in and advocates for researcher practitioner partnerships differently. And to capture this complexity of research translation, we proposed this conceptual framework called Research Translation Continuum, which you see here on the slide. This framework illustrates the range of ways to produce useful evidence and the range of ways that academics and practitioners can engage collaboratively with research translation. I apologize for the dog. I think somebody came to the door, sorry. And so on one end of the spectrum, you can see the proactive research translation that's on the left. And that's what we identified as intentionally planning for evidence use before research begins and ensuring continuous collaboration between the academic researchers and practitioners until evidence is utilized to change policy or practice. On the other end, or the right-hand side, you can see that we called it post facto translation. And this is applying academic research to policy or practice after the research has been conducted and published. And in this one, there's minimal collaboration between academic researchers and practitioners. And between these two ends of proactive and post facto research translation, there's numerous variations of research translation approaches. And this continuum illustrates that there is not one approach and there's not one side of the continuum that is better or worse. It depends on the context. So as you can also see, there's 2 spectrums within our continuum. One is the evidence utilization spectrum that's on the bottom, and that illustrates incremental change in forethought for evidence utilization. And there's reference points along each of those. So in the evidence utilization spectrum, there's an incremental decrease in forethought from left to right. And then in the partner engagement spectrum on top, there's an incremental decrease from left to right in the commitment to partnership and collaboration between researchers and practitioners along the continuum. Next slide. So we have 5 key takeaways from the literature review. First, as I just explained with the continuum, research translation incorporates a range of approaches from post facto to proactive research translation. Second, as the spectrums illustrated, evidence use and partner engagement are interrelated when conducting research translation. Generally speaking, we found that most scholars concluded that increased meaningful participation with partners improved the potential to produce relevant research and the adoption of outcomes. But there is circumstances, for example, politics, where you would want research and practitioners to be separated so that politics doesn't influence the outcomes of the research. Third, through our comparative analysis, we found 4 interrelated factors that differentiate the research translation approaches. First, intention for research use. Second, the commitment to partnership. Third, understanding of context. And fourth, the investment of time and resources. Because they are interrelated, an increase or decrease in any of these factors influence the conditions for research translation and therefore shape the design, implementation, and outcomes. Fourth, we found that power imbalances between researchers and practitioners arising from a lack of meaningful engagement and limited inclusion of diverse knowledges can hinder research translation. Our research indicated the need for and the benefits of shared power between researchers and practitioners, especially for increasing the use of research translation outcomes. Lastly, we found that the embedded research translation model is an agnostic model that's not applicable to any research methodology or sector, in which close collaborations with practitioners and a more proactive form of research translation is desired. I now pass the presentation on to Alex, and she will explain more what embedded research translation is.
Thanks, Laura. We're a few minutes early, and there are a couple of questions in the chat. So I think we can maybe take 2 or 3 minutes and respond to them, and then I can continue on with the session around ERT.
Great.
There was one question from Taye who asked, what do you mean by embedded in this context? I know, Priyanka, you had one response, but Laura, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. Priyanka had shared on the proactive research translation side, since the research is co-produced, the research is contextual. Anything you want to add? What do we mean by embedded?
I think that's going to come out a lot more in the conversation with Alex as she explains what embedded research translation is. Embedded didn't come out in the literature review at all, just to make that clear.
Then there's a second question from Jennifer. I'm curious what barriers exist to engage researchers in the translation process. Are there incentives that can move people across the continuum?
I think there's a lot of barriers. And we have a whole section that we wrote about in the literature review on barriers. And a lot of them are systemic. It's not necessarily personal barriers. The personal side could be just a lack of knowledge. Like I said, there's not really one process that a scholar can say, okay, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'll have my research translated and it'll be done. It's complicated because of the context of each project. And also at the systemic level, there's problems in finding the best partners to work with or having your academic institution fund your translation partners or the people you want to work with in the field. There's also academic problems in the time that a research translation project could take. It might not be able to have a peer-reviewed publication come out fast enough to work with your 10-year process. And so if you're investing a lot of time in making sure that your research is useful and can have uptake, that's not always valued in academic circles. So I think there's some personal and then some structural limitations that prohibit or limit the engagement of researchers in this.
Great, thanks, Laura. And Jennifer, there were also some comments from Priyanka and Yuen about a separate study that LASER carried out on barriers and incentives to collaboration. Okay, well, we will pick up the presentation then to talk a bit more about embedded research translation. So I would like to begin by introducing as well as defining, as we call it, ERT, or embedded research translation. It's defined as an iterative co-design process among academics, practitioners, and other stakeholders in which research is intentionally designed and applied for a development challenge. So this is quite different than the more kind of classical ways that we think about research translation, and that it's a two-phase process, that you carry out the research and then you translate it. With ERT, the translation, so to speak, happens at the very beginning, that we're embedding those broader stakeholders, the practitioners, the policymakers, donors, governments, et cetera, into the process from the very beginning. So we ensure that the research questions from the very start, as well as the products that are developed, are something that are applicable and that can be useful and applied right away. So along with our ERT model, it's characterized by very deep collaboration, which you can see in the infinity loop diagram here, that it's really core to the success of it and core to its overall approach is that deep and ongoing collaboration that happens throughout the entire process. The broader structure that we've given it to it are what we call 4 pillars: partnership, process, product, and dissemination. So again, critical to the model is having the right people in the room. That's partnership. Process is ensuring that then they're able to work well together, that you can't just put people together and assume that things will go well. You really have to develop, whether it's standard operating procedures or even agreements, or just a way of understanding and respecting one another to make sure that your research and your translation products are something that are really successful. Product then, of course, that's what a lot of people think about when it comes to translation. And I think that also came out in the word cloud that Laura shared. So it's also about actually creating something tangible, useful, things like articles, peer-reviewed articles, publications, conferences. That's a part of research. But when we talk about research translation products, it's things like apps that farmers or women that work in the market can use. It's things like trainings and guides and really tangible things that can guide policy and practice. And lastly, dissemination. And dissemination, even though you see these pillars lined up, it's not a linear process. All these things, including dissemination, is something that should be thought about from the very beginning. So you continue to carry out your research, you continue to carry out collaboration with your dissemination plan and that intent in mind. Next slide, please. So at this time, we're going to have one additional Menti exercise. If Patrick, you can drop that link quickly into the chat. There we go. And in this question, I'm going to be asking you which approaches to research translation you are already familiar with. And as we start to switch over, these are the 5 models or the 5 research translation approaches that we investigated in our study. So they include technology transfer. Those of you that come from the agricultural sciences may be familiar with that one. Participatory action research, evidence-based policymaking, knowledge translation, integrated knowledge translation, which come more from the health sciences. And if you're not familiar with any of those, you're also welcome to select none or other. There are, of course, as Laura mentioned, this wide sweeping and almost overwhelming range of approaches to doing this. And we certainly didn't capture all of them in our study. We recognize that you may be familiar with additional ones. Again, you can just click on that link. It'll just take you directly to answer these questions. It's completely anonymous. We don't know who's saying what. It's just a chance for us to gauge what you may be familiar with. And based on the 8 responses that we have so far, it looks like evidence-based policymaking is the one that you're most familiar with. That's not surprising. That's certainly something I think that any of us that are involved in the development world, we're familiar with evidence-based policymaking. So I'll wait another maybe 5 seconds if anyone wanted to chime in. We've got about 12 people so far, and it looks like evidence-based policymaking and PAR, participatory action research, are the two that you're most familiar with. Great, thanks, Patrick. If you can switch back to the presentation. So with that in mind, those 5 different approaches, one of the additional objectives of our literature review was to then take ERT and compare it to each one of these different models to see if it really is innovative, to see what really is different about it. So in this table, you'll see the similarities across each of these 5 approaches, as well as embedded research translation and the differences. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the similarities. For example, just to call one out, in participatory action, there's this intent to really have an iterative, collaborative, action-focused approach that can be used to change either policy or practice. And that's very similar to ERT. So there are some things that we have built upon existing models, but some things are very different, and that's what I'd like to focus on. So for example, in technology transfer, there's a real emphasis, and again, this comes from the agricultural sciences, for those of you that are maybe not as familiar, but there's an emphasis on disseminating new agricultural technologies to broader stakeholders and for their adoption. It doesn't necessarily include policy and practice as much. It's more about a new tool or a new device or a new variety of seed, et cetera. And the focus is then on adoption and behavior change, where ERT really pulls in that collaborative nature from the very beginning. And I recognize that in technology transfer has shifted a little bit over the years, that it has gotten a little bit more participatory. But when you at least look at it historically and how most of the projects that have applied technology transfer, it does tend to have that more kind of one-way street. Participatory action research, as I mentioned, it is similar to ERT in some ways, but PAR really has an emphasis on changing research through power dynamics. So it's about bringing practitioners onto the same page as researchers. And it also tends to focus more kind of micro scale, in the sense that PAR projects often focus on one community or a smaller geographic setting, where ERT is focusing more on changing research translation, broadly speaking, to a more iterative model. So we include power dynamics, that's a part of bringing, again, researchers, practitioners, other stakeholders on the same page, but it tends to operate in a kind of a larger geographic space and on a larger scale. So all of our projects include, for example, may include practitioners from an NGO or ministry officials from a government, a local government or a national government, but it doesn't necessarily have that granular feel that PAR does. It operates at a little bit higher level. In terms of EBPM, which is the model that most of you said you were most familiar with, it really includes little to no collaboration, because as Laura has mentioned, you don't want those practitioners and those researchers or policymakers working that closely together, because there is the possibility to introduce bias or to have policymakers intentionally or not intentionally influence the course of the research. Where in ERT, it's something that we really encourage, that deep, close and ongoing collaboration from the very beginning. And then knowledge translation and IKT, as I mentioned, they come from the health sciences. It doesn't seem like all of you were as familiar with those approaches. But one of the main critiques of KT, knowledge translation, is that it doesn't have necessarily a lot of conceptual clarity around it, or a lot of very straightforward processes. Where in ERT, as I had mentioned, we developed these 4 pillars that are really the foundation and the core of how we support all of our projects to carry out the model and to carry out their work. And then lastly, IKT was developed specifically for healthcare. And out of all of these approaches, IKT is probably the most similar to ERT. However, as Laura had mentioned, one of the key findings when we looked at all of these is IKT is really sector agnostic. It can be applied to any discipline, whether it's agriculture, environmental sciences, engineering, health, across the board. And it's also method agnostic. So it can really support the more qualitative approaches, as well as random controlled trials, statistics, kind of anything in between. So this again is a capture of how ERT complements as well as builds upon, and really is an innovative and different way of carrying out research translation and international development. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I took that, as you call it, the rainbow or the continuum that Laura had presented, along with those 2 spectrums. and placed ERT within it. So if we look at the partner engagement spectrum, which is that one across the top, and that ranges from more minimal interaction like we would see in EBPM to really co-productive, intensive collaboration between researchers and practitioners, ERT lands on the more co-productive side. In terms of evidence utilization spectrum, which goes from evidence diffusion, meaning that the research is carried out and then it's published, maybe a practitioner will pick it up, maybe they won't, to the other side of evidence impact evaluation, where you really look to see whether or not the evidence was taken up and you formally carry out a study to determine what impact it had. ERT lands someplace, again, on that more left end, but not quite in the sense of evidence impact evaluation. It's a little closer to evidence uptake. ERT so far has only been applied in laser pulse funded projects, and they are usually around a 2-year duration, give or take. And so we just haven't had the time either within a project or the sense that laser pulse is ongoing. We still have another year before we formally wrap up. We haven't had a chance to actually evaluate that impact. So ERT lands someplace kind of in between those two. I also wanted to give an example of the partnership engagement spectrum. So most of our practitioners, which are the translation partners on our products, are actually considered co-PIs, and they receive budgets within the funding for the research. So that goes to show, again, that really collaborative nature. It's not just something you're doing in name, but it's something that is integral to the project in the sense that practitioners are also receiving funding for their contributions to the project. Next slide, please. My final slide is the more kind of practical piece around ERT. So to support all of our projects in carrying out embedded research translation, we've developed a whole host of resources, courses, templates, tools, etc. I just have a few screenshots of 4 of them that I wanted to mention. The first one on the far left is our Laser Pulse Introduction to Embedded Research Translation Training. This is a free course that we've developed. If you are a member of the network, you are able to take it. We encourage everyone to join. If you're not, it's certainly free to become a member. And this is also something that's required of all of our projects. So very early on, before they even apply for funding, they are required to take this training so they can then integrate it into their applications for funding. Secondly, I have a screenshot of our promising practices for embedded research translation. This is kind of a complement to the peer-reviewed literature review that we did, where we surveyed a broad range of practitioner literature to really find those practices and those strategies that align most closely with ERT. Since it is still an experiment, so to speak, it's innovative, it's something new. We can't say best practices quite yet, so we're calling them promising practices, but it's a whole host of a toolkit of resources, different case studies, some examples from our projects, and how to implement those 4 pillars of our model. The third screenshot is our research translation literature review. It is currently on USAID's deck. However, it's embargoed because we're in the process of publishing it in a peer-reviewed article. So stay tuned for when that is publicly available. And lastly, I have a screenshot of our stakeholder engagement plan. I'm sure many of you are familiar with stakeholder engagement. It's kind of a core critical part of development work. And we've developed one specifically around the embedded research translation model. So again, all of these resources are available through our Laser Pulse network, and there are many more. I just wanted to call out a few of them. Next slide, please. All right, at this time, and I think I missed a lot of chat and questions. I wasn't able to kind of keep an eye on that, but I trust my colleagues were able to answer any questions and continue the conversation going. We also wanted to switch gears and hear from some of our projects. So as I mentioned, Laura and I are also going to be joined now by Priyanka Brunese, who is a research scientist. She was also a part as a researcher on one of our USAID buy-ins, by Juan, who is a project manager and represents the practitioner perspective. And he'll be speaking a bit about the project he's been involved in, another USAID buy-in around traditional cultural practices in northern Iraq. And then we'll also hear from Yuan Yi as academic director of Laser Pulse, kind of some of the bigger thinking around embedded research translation and how it supports innovation in education. So maybe we can start then with Yuen. I'd like to circle back to you. You started by presenting the Laser Pulse project. I'd like to ask, as an academic and as a professor at Purdue, could you reflect a little bit on how ERT really supports innovation? And in particular, how would you pitch it to your fellow faculty at Purdue? Over to you, Yuen.
Thank you, Alex. This is a sort of interesting journey for me. I'm a professor in industrial engineering over 33 years at Purdue. And my work is in the complex system and decision making. And so throughout my career, I have been working with many different partners, industrial partners and healthcare providers, government, NGOs, and also other academic researchers in different disciplines. So in the way, I believe that any complex system have very unique characteristics, and it's sort of its own physics rule to control its performance. So you can think about the system can be as small as a device and as big as this entire laser program. So I consider myself a very conscious about this kind of collaboration work, and really intentionally design how I conduct my research with a partner that really have a lot of knowledge to share and exchange. And that type of interdiscipline, I would say more of a transdiscipline, that we actually start change how we do things and how do we think about research from the fundamental way. So I can use one of the example of my work. This is before laser, so it's before ERT. I have an opportunity to work with the first responder of many humanitarian aids with a CRS partner. And I found this a really rewarding experience to learn and gain insight about the operation, the process, and then most importantly, we identify exactly what we need to do to improve the current process. So we'll have be able to benefit more people and save lives. So we have spent a lot of time to really co-design exactly what are the workflow. We all understand technology is only a small piece of the puzzles, but exactly how to use it, who to use it, where and when. And that's also very important knowledge exchange to understand exactly when those technology can be helpful and when this is actually not being helpful. With that, we co-create the solution and implement it currently in South Sudan. That experience is one of my highlights of my career, and it really make impact to people's life and make some system change. And how do we do humanitarian operations? However, looking back, now I have more understanding, more systematic way of understand ERT. This particular process really made me think that there are some missed opportunity in my own work. Even I consider myself very good at it, has a lot of experience in it. So there are a lot of those pieces, for example, stakeholder mapping, stakeholder analysis, and stakeholder engagement, as well as the dissemination strategy and also sustainability of this particular solution. How do we really consider this right from the beginning and not at the end? So all this, it needs to happen at the right time, at the right place. And I thought those are very critical points that I missed in this particular project, which I consider a great success. But I believe with those, guided book, ERT, I consider is a guidebook for researcher like me to really manage the research activity and understand when it's a good time to have certain activity to make sure that the final product actually will be useful, will be impactful, and also will be sustainable. So this is my personal experience with knowing ERT, and I wish I had this when I started my project. But I really think this is very helpful even for people with a lot of experience with this kind of collaborative work. Back to you, Alex.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that example, Yuen. I think sometimes it's good to have those experiences and then to also be able to stop and reflect and to see how you would do them differently based on all the learning we've achieved over the first few years of Laser Pulse. So many thanks for sharing that. Laura, over to you.
Great. I would like to invite Priyanka to turn on her camera and get off mute also. So I want to ask you, Priyanka, as an academic who has worked in projects now with Laser Pulse, can you tell us briefly about the USAID buy-in project you were part of and how you were able to operationalize ERT in it?
Thanks, Laura, of course. So just to give everybody a background, as academics, we are not really trained to, we're trained to collaborate with other academics, but we're not really trained to collaborate with a lot of practitioners, right? So when this opportunity came up to work with USAID's private sector engagement hub that's based in Washington, DC, they really came to Laser Pulse because they wanted to understand what factors kind of enable or hinder the success of private sector engagement in the development and humanitarian context. And so when this opportunity came up, it was interesting because typically as an academic, you always start with, let's do a literature review, let's understand where the gaps are in the literature, and then come up with research questions. But this model of using ERT was very different because from the start, the problem, the need came from USAID. This came from our practitioners, coming to us and saying, this is the issue, this is the gap that we see in our work. And we really, think that there is justification for this research. And then as we kind of went through the process, it was a really close-knit and deep collaboration with the USAID team. It wasn't like traditional research where, you get the grant and then you start developing your research design and then you go conduct it. But in this case, my USAID partners were actually jointly designing the research with me, mapping out sampling criteria. How do we collect data? How do we identify which case studies to really collect data from? And this was really important because they guided us on what type of partnerships should we investigate, what sectors, regions don't have enough evidence on private sector engagement, how we should focus on engaging the missions and regions that don't have, this type of work. And also, from the beginning, start to think about which missions, which bureaus might be actually interested in utilizing this research. So it wasn't at the end of this research that we're brainstorming how to disseminate our work, but from the start, we were able to really identify some of these questions. And so through our research, it wasn't just doing the research, writing a report, let's publish a journal paper, but it was really focused on developing these translated products. And we developed a lot of tools, which is based on this evidence. It's based on this field-based research. And now that we've written the report, the idea is to, I like using the word intentional because that was the thing that was very different with ERT, that it was intentionally we were thinking about dissemination and utilization of our work. And so what was really unique and different is that even though the project ended, one of the cool things that happened is the PSE Hub actually allocated more funds for me to help with the dissemination and interact with the missions and bureaus so that we can now really have them utilize some of our work. So again, there was a question in the chat about it being contextual. This is kind of the true, aspect of ERT that I learned, is that the work that we did was very contextual to the missions, the bureaus that are challenging, faces challenges in doing private sector engagement work. And so ERT really helped us, make sure that our research was relevant to the people that were going to use this research. So I'll kind of pause there, Laura, if you have, or anybody else has other questions. I will plug in though, if you don't mind, is we are presenting on May 17th about this research on private sector engagement in the education space. So if y'all have time and can come, I would love for y'all to join that session too.
Great, thanks. So it sounds like the research and the work that you were engaged in was really proactive. As you said, it was very intentional and thought out from the very beginning. And you mentioned that it was different from the way that you'd been trained to do research. Do you think there was one part of it that was particularly challenging for you to change your mindset? What was the biggest hurdle?
Yeah, I think as academics, we are used to getting the research question, going and doing the research, coming back and presenting, this is what we found, right? And really changing that at every step of the way, we're interacting with our USAID partners. They're giving us feedback. We're constantly pivoting and changing the research design, which can be really frustrating for a lot of academics. And so trying to really be humble and think about, at the end of the day, who is the end user? This is not just about creating a journal publication, but it's about making this research really relevant to USAID. That was the mind shift for me.
Cool. And so Elena had a question in the chat, and I think this is a good one to ask you also. Can you step back or maybe dig in a little bit more? Like, what did it look like in the nitty gritty? Like, how did this research project look on a day-to-day differently compared to a regular one? So if somebody wanted to use ERT, what would they have to change in terms of like meeting or funding or those, granular aspects of research?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Elena. I think practically speaking, one of the lessons learned, as I mentioned, is most research projects, we don't think about dissemination. We don't put funding for dissemination as part of our research budget. And we think about it at the end, right? Now, and that's something that happened. So practically speaking, some of the things that really were different in this process is, one, from the beginning, all of the research meetings happened with USAID. They were very involved in understanding and helping identify, what is it that we should be looking at? How should we be collecting the data? It wasn't about us developing a research design and then just presenting it to them, but it was truly having a lot of co-creation meetings. So part of our research was that USAID's private sector engagement process is a very complex process, and they didn't have it documented anywhere. And so we were able to actually co-produce what this process even looks like, and then how do we identify what to do with that process. So that's this, practically speaking, it's this co-production, like sitting in front of each other and really discussing what is it that we need from this research. I don't know if that answered your question, Elena.
Well, just because I know a little bit more about this project, how often did you meet with USAID? What was that, like monthly, weekly?
Oh, it was weekly. It was very intense. So it went in a lot of phases, right? So there was some phases where we might have to we might have to go and study, since I wasn't aware of a lot of USAID processes. So there were times when I had to study a lot of that. But then when we were co-producing this research and the design, it was a weekly meeting. And honestly, right now, even through dissemination, we have a weekly meeting every Wednesday where we're deciding how do we engage different missions and bureaus for dissemination.
So Elena, I see you have a question to follow up on. I want to make sure we hear from our last panelist, who's going to present the practitioner perspective. So please keep your question until the end, and we'll definitely have time at the end.
Great, thank you, Laura and Priyanka. Since we've had two researcher perspectives, two academic perspectives, I'd like to turn it over to Juan, who is representing the practitioner side of things. If you could just briefly tell us about your project as well, and in particular, how did ERT help your team to connect academic research to support innovation? Over to you, Juan.
Thank you so much, Alex, and the Laser Pulse team for the invitation. So I'm supporting the Northern Iraq buy-in project that's called Supported Traditional Cultural Practices in Northern Iraq. So as you might be aware, the Islamic State occupied Northern Iraq between 2014 to 2017, and in the aftermath of and after the occupation and after the Islamic State was expelled from the Nineveh Plains, it was obvious that they had a very specific intention of almost wiping out of the face of the country some of the religious and ethnic groups that have historically lived there. One of the tactics that they used was actually burning the farms of villagers and farmers from these communities. You know, all these, along with the killings, the enslavement, the displacement, and other types of environmental destruction. So, what we were looking at through this project was to think how we could help recover livelihoods, agricultural livelihoods that were devastated, and how we could, through this recovery, help in revitalizing some of the cultural practices and social practices that these groups had had throughout their history. So what we intend to do is to leverage the material well-being of farmers and villagers in a way that we help them reestablish and rejuvenate cultural, religious, and social practices. In a way, this buy-in expects to promote a more comprehensive approach to projects that is not only based on technical dimensions, that also raises the profile of cultural and social diversity and social values and cultural practices through agriculture. So in a way, the project seeks to integrate both agriculture and culture in a way that addresses the meaningfulness of these different practices. And I think in this way, research has helped us kind of zero in into, you know, what means for people in Nineveh to be able to carry out the agricultural activities that they have traditionally carried out. So in a way, what we seek is that an integration that provides depth to highly technical aid sectors such as agriculture. And I think this approach helps tying technical outcomes to improvements in the quality of life of people in Nineveh, particularly in terms of social cohesion, identity, and an improved sense of belonging, and feelings of safety in a place which, you know, historically they have been targeted just for being different. Back to you, Alex.
Great. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, it's clear the kind of heartfelt nature and the really in-depth perspective that you bring to this real challenge that people are facing. We don't have a lot of time left. I wish I could pull out so much more of all of the wisdom and experience you've gained, Juan. If I could just ask you, is there one piece of advice that you would give researchers to work better with practitioners? What would it be?
I think one of the things that we have benefited the most from is from having a researcher throughout the project implementation, you know, like someone with research capacity and knowledge that can look at how we do implementation and bring in some of these insights into how we frame the work that we do. So we're constantly collecting data, we're constantly engaging with people, and constantly, you know, getting insights and knowledge from people on site, and being able to look at these data and all this information from a researcher perspective. You know, instead of looking at completing objectives, just us asking questions and framing these questions into hypotheses. I think that would help us implement in a better way. You know, be more mindful about what is meaningful and important to people instead of what is, you know, just meaningful for the implementing organization in terms of achieving certain outcomes or achieving certain objectives, and just comply with what is required. So, you know, at the end, we're trying to look, you know, beyond the outcome, and we're trying to frame the work that we do in terms of long-lasting social impact.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I know we have only about 30 seconds left, so I wanted to thank you again, Juan, as well as Priyanka and Yuan for sharing your experiences, as well as all of the participants. I know there's been a really lively and ongoing conversation. And let's keep the conversation going. And Huva, and feel free to reach out to any of us. We invite you all and hope that you're able to join the Laser Pulse Network. And before we get cut off from today's session, I just invite everyone, if you want to quickly drop in your one key takeaway from today's session, that's helpful for us moving forward. So as you're signing off and saying goodbye, if you could also just share one thing that really struck you differently, or about again, an innovative way to think about research translation, we'd welcome those insights. And thanks again, and we look forward to continue to engage throughout the summit.